Well, good afternoon. Dear friends, welcome to a conversation on accountable autonomy, or essentially how we deal with killer robots. First of all, I'd like to thank, on behalf of the panel here, the ORF for a magnificent event. It's been quite an honor to be here, and it really is an institution nowadays. My name is Hans Christian Hagman. I am the strategic analysis head in Stockholm in Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Sweden, and I deal with long-term issues, but also work across government on that. And in all of our discussions, India is part of that strategic conversation. I'm joined here by a distinguished panel with great people. We have on my far right, Frederick from the Center for New American Security. We have Major General Susan Ridge from the UK MOD. We have Dr. Renata Dwan from the UN Institute of Disarmament Research. And we have Dr. Gilles Carbonnier from the ICRC. I must admit that I'm intimidated by things I don't really understand or grasp. This is one of those subjects. So if there are any issues here which you do not fully grasp, you're not alone. But I think we can be confident that as we're talking about the future here, weapon systems and challenges which are not really there, they're on the cusp of being here, we will all be wrong, more or less. So be confident that we will all be surprised about the future, more or less. But what we can do is contribute to openness to the subject and to discuss the challenges, the opportunities, the pros and cons, the limitations, to open our minds so that we have a preparedness for the changes and challenges to come. Now, there are many angles to this. There's a wealth of angles. It's ethics and values, it's international humanitarian law, it's democratic decision-making, transparency and accountability. It is operational efficiency. It is geostrategy. What is China, the United States, and Russia, who are the key players in this technology, what are they doing? And how will wars be fought in the future? But it's also down to technology and technical issues. Now, technology and warfare have always gone hand in hand, from Chinese rockets to longbows to crossbows to dreadnoughts to stealth aircraft and Stuxnets. That's 5,000 years in one grasp. But all warfare is about asymmetry. And I think this is what we're coming into time and time again, and how you combine various elements to achieve an advantage. And in this digital era, the cyber realm is as essential as the air that we breathe. It permeates all the aspects of this topic, but also presents challenges and vulnerabilities at the same time. Let me start with 4 short observations. At the core is a maturation of technologies. The holy trinity of AI is access to large amounts of data, computing power, not least with supercomputers, and thirdly, algorithms. You have to make sense of all the data. See it as, for example, facial recognition from a UAV. It's one thing to be able to see whatever, that needs technology, but you have to be able to make sense of the data and identify what is what, and then another issue, what to do with it. And autonomy is one thing. We've had autopilot for a long time. But the interesting with AI is a self-learning element, that when weapon systems will be smarter when they come back from a deployment rather than before. The second observation is that we should be careful to extrapolate. It's not the 1 + 1 + 1 is equal to 3. It will be 1 + 1 + 1 is equal to 5, or maybe 50. So when we combine AI with nanotech, synthetic biology, hypersonics, space-to-space warfare, swarm technology, and quantum, what happens then? And we don't have a clue, but a lot will change. The third, most civilian services and bureaucracies are conservative. I represent one of them. We are slow to adapt and to adopt technologies. And sometimes the same goes for armed services and defense industry. We know what we know, but it's a bit outside the box to think of the unknown and new technology, which is changing at a rapid speed. There will be relative winners and losers. And finally, fourth, almost all AI is dual use. And as the Chinese talk about, civil-military fusion. And we should just bear that in mind. That's difficult to compartmentalize technology. It's how you use the technology which is interesting, and how and who will use the asymmetry to their own advantage. So this is a conversation focused on human control over lethal, autonomous weapon systems. What limitations are possible and realistic, and how do we get there? But I would also like to push the conversation a bit towards the future. If I may start with Kara, a researcher at Center for New American Security, which is one of the top think tanks in Washington when it comes to these questions. It's very closely linked to the Pentagon, has outstanding output. She has a background in intel from the U.S. Navy counterterrorism, from the Pentagon, worked at Facebook before being at the Center for New American Security. Could you please start off with some discussion on the pace of development, but also give us a more realistic and operational perspective, how you see the nexus between autonomous weapon systems, asymmetry, irregular warfare, and human control? Start us off.
All right, absolutely. Thank you for the intro. And I want to start by saying thank you to ORF for having me. It's a pleasure to be back in New Delhi. Thank you to Samir and all the fellows who do all the work behind the scenes to put this on. It's no small feat, so very much appreciated. To get to your question, so I want to frame my remarks more based on my experience in the field. So perhaps offer a tactical, hands-on perspective on the use of AI and autonomous capabilities in a contemporary battle space. So I wrote briefly in the Raisina files this year about a time on one of my deployments with the United States Special Operations Forces. And about 4 years ago, the commander of one of the units that I was supporting out there turned to me, and he asked me to make a decision involving the use of semi-autonomous weapons, or drones. So all the mental checklists, the judgment, the critical thinking, and the general process that takes place when making a decision like that is understandably intricate and extraordinarily heavy. So rightly so, right? And this happened at least 50 times over the course of my deployments. But we're not even talking about drones anymore. All of us here on this panel are talking about what happens when the technology after drones comes to bear. So the potential for weapons that are actually fully autonomous. Some of them are in use today. You think about loitering munitions and the Israeli Harpy, that kind of thing. But we're talking a couple paces after that. My take, especially in the context of this debate, is that if a machine selected, identified, and took lethal action on its own, then we'd be in grave trouble as human beings. As one of my colleagues says, humans are morally responsible for what happens on the battlefield. So what can we do? I submit to all of you today that we have to make governance decisions in the context of 3 realities. One is that law's technology, especially AI, is outpacing the diplomatic process. 2, the regulation of these weapons is not ineluctable. And 3, that machines can enhance and support our efforts, but the role of humans in lethal decision-making is absolutely critical. And as background for this, in 2016, the former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, General Paul Selva, he told the Washington, D.C. think tank in April of that year that the notion of a completely robotic system that can make a decision whether or not to inflict harm on an adversary is here. It's not terribly refined, it's not terribly good, but it's here. And that technology, driven by advances in artificial intelligence, is moving so fast. AI is going to have an enormous impact on the character of war and profoundly affect military strategy, whereas previous war machines were stronger, think tanks, think submarines, think planes. The war machines of the future are going to be smarter. There's already plenty of national security uses of artificial intelligence, right? In the military, in intelligence, information, economics, politically so. And even at a more granular level, AI is going to help militaries do things better, like have better situational awareness, electromagnetic spectrum dominance, decoys, camouflage, C2, and tactics as well. But the point is that humans at this point, utilizing AI, are still determining the target of when they unleash this technology. Yet they're getting better. And before I close, I'll just give a brief instance of how these machines are getting better so we get a taste of how the technology is progressing. Machines can coordinate actions at speed and scale that humans just can't. It's impossible for them. One example of this is swarms. You've probably heard of it. And these are cooperative, autonomous robots that react to the battlefield as one and at machine speed. And what they do is humans control some tasks, but they delegate others to the swarm. And this idea of delegation, it poses questions of risk. So machines can fail hugely if pushed outside the bounds of their programming. And some of those consequences are potential escalations of crises, large-scale accidents, and failures replicated across a multitude of systems. As unpredictable systems interacting with unpredictable systems sort of increase the risk. So ultimately, unfortunately, we're at the stage in our research where there are more questions than answers. But my bottom line, in response to your question and some of the questions that we'll tackle today, is that I see the delegation of control to machines, particularly when it comes to the use of lethal force, as a serious game. No increase in efficacy is worth the cost incurred by ceding decision-making responsibility to machines. Machines can enhance and support our efforts, but human judgment is critical.
Thank you very much. From being intimidated, I'm scared now. That was very interesting. What I would like to think about is what happens when others are playing by other rules in the future. But let me first move on to Susan. She's Director General of the Army Legal Services. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so can you help me understand what are the key legal questions and limitations and help me make sense of this from a legal perspective?
Thank you very
General.
much. I have to apologise from the outset. I have brought with me the common English cold. I had hoped that it would make me sound like Marlene Dietrich. Sadly, it makes me sound like Mickey Mouse. So if you can tolerate that, I'm really sorry. I'm also very grateful that I have been given this opportunity to appear on this very distinguished panel, people very experienced. And in that context, perhaps I ought to just explain what I do. You've heard that my panel members advise at the tactical, but also at what might be called strategic and political level. My officers are military lawyers who deploy with the chain of command, and so they advise commanders on the ground. Importantly, they also deal with something called weapon reviews, as do the service lawyers from the other two services. And weapon reviews may be quite key in this area. Our moderator started by talking about killer robots. And of course, that's one of the issues with this area, that we may not actually be talking about killer robots. We could be talking about all manner of things, and one of the issues is deciding what you mean by lethal autonomous weapon systems. And that is what I'm going to talk about, which is laws. Now, to give you an example, I will read what the UK definition of a lethal autonomous weapon system is. And the UK defines it as a system capable of understanding higher level intent and direction. From this understanding and its perception of its environment, such a system is able to take appropriate action to bring about a desired state. It's capable of deciding a course of action from a number of alternatives without depending on human oversight and control, although these may still be present. So it's talking about a level, as Cara was saying, of self-learning, and also about a level of judgment. Now, in UK terms, the UK would say that actually we don't believe that such weapons currently exist on the basis of that definition, and that they are not yet imminent. And that, of course, is one of the issues that you may want to delve into a bit more. From the perspective of some of the legal aspects of this, there is already a framework which governs both the use and the approval of weapons. And that is, of course, international humanitarian law. And IHL has 4 fundamental principles which impact on the use of weapons, and they, of course, are distinction, proportionality, necessity, and humanity. The application of lethal force itself employs several critical functions, not least the selection and engagement of a target. Now, while some of that can be done autonomously, I think we would say that the principles of IHL and the requirement for assessing the tasks implicit in a strike mean that they can only be assessed and applied by a human exercising judgment, understanding context, and applying experience. So, as Cara mentioned, that the nature and decisiveness of human control over critical functions is a key consideration. But also, there's another aspect of international humanitarian law which is, in this area, as I've said, probably key, and that is the role of international law in using weapon reviews as a means of a gatekeeper to prevent systems which do not comply with the existing law from being deployed on the battlefield. And that is basically Article 36 of the additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, which requires states to determine whether any new weapon being procured or added to the inventory or means and methods of warfare can be employed lawfully on the battlefield. And the importance of a weapon review is that it enables the process of a legality of a weapon to be conducted at an early stage, and it enables the legality of a weapon to be considered on a weapon-by-weapon basis, rather than trying to deal with broad, not yet fully understood principles. And although relatively few states comply with the requirement to undertake a weapon review, I do think that this is an area which, if we could encourage more states to engage in that type of process, would be of a fundamental benefit in this area.
Thank you very much. I'm slightly more confused on a higher level now, but thank you for those clarifications. May I move over to Dr. Renata Dwan, Director of UN Institute for Disarmament Research. But Renata, you also have a distinguished career in peacekeeping, one of the key thinkers in peacekeeping development for a long time, but also in a think tank background with CIPRI and the East-West Institute, but also in the EU. Help us through some of the regulatory elements of autonomous weapon systems. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and you're very good to be this lively still at such on day 3 in the afternoon. I will also extend my thanks to ORF for the great opportunity and for the fantastic agenda that they've put. Today I was opening the Times of India, and there was a cartoon in the Times of India, a Dilbert cartoon, in which a CEO said, when is my job going to be taken over by a robot? And the robot said, when the empathy program that I have in me is taken out. So I think, you know, it captures two things for me. It captures that what we're talking about and the issues that we're talking about pertain not just to weapons. We're dealing with them in everything from what sort of jobs will we work at in the next 30 years to how will we make ethical decisions about having children, if we think about some of the current research that has been a lot in the news about stem cell and other processes. So there's many, many questions that we're thinking about and that are impacted by new technologies. Second aspect of this is that India is very much at the cutting edge of some of these debates and these discussions. You've prioritized science and technology as a key enabler for your growth and development, but also as some of your key participations at a global level. And in the discussions around the regulation and how we might think about international consensus and processes to regulate autonomous weapon systems, it has been India, I think, that has been playing a particularly important role in some of these discussions. So if I think of it from the Geneva perspective, and the perspective of attempts by member states to articulate and regulate these newly emerging capacities, what are some of the issues and the dilemmas that we've thought about? Well, one of the big dilemmas has been trying to identify what it is we want to regulate. And those questions have been really difficult. There's been discussions about lethality. Are we frightened? Are we concerned because of just how much the scale of devastation and lethality can be? So to that extent, echoing some of the concerns around weapons of mass destruction. Cara mentioned some of the issues that have led others to be concerned about, which is safety, predictability, predictability of an algorithm that you don't know quite when it will work well and when it hasn't worked, and you haven't experienced all scenarios in which it might operate. But also, as Cara talked about, what about when different algorithms and capabilities and systems talk and work together, and how does that, the unpredictability that we have. Then there's issues of other sorts of risks that include bias, newer emerging issue in the question of regulation. Who programs the algorithm and what do they think about? Whether from a gender perspective to a cultural perspective to issues that we think about facial recognition. Who defines what's considered dark, light, and other such complex factors? And then, of course, there's the accountability issue. So some of the challenge why we've been discussing autonomous weapon systems for quite some years now, certainly over 10 years, but have had such difficulty in grappling is we're not exactly clear what it is we're trying to regulate. Two things that I think are worth us thinking about that have emerged out of that. The term that we're all using, meaningful human control, is itself a spectrum. We do not have a clear, agreed definition. Concepts and understandings of control differ according to cultures and perspectives. And we might be better off seeing control as a spectrum rather than a black and white issue. Second issue is automation, as Susan and Cara have flagged, are also itself a spectrum, and a spectrum that are different definitions. Some people here feel that full automation is already in existence. Others, according to Susan's definition, say it's not quite there yet. So that's the world that we're looking at. Now, there's a significant debate, and I'm sure that we'll hear from Gilles about it, about whether increased accuracy, increased speed, increased facility, increased ability to enter into a contested war space and battleground might bring some benefits to thinking about war, might bring greater accuracy, might bring less risk. And indeed, if we look at the level of soldier fatality in many of our modern conflicts, we've gotten automation and aspects of automation have protected combatants. My own view is that we've thought less about civilians, and there's some real concern about that, but I'll just flag that. So where have we got on the regulation to date? Well, member states have met for some years now in a group of governmental experts under a framework that is very boring, but I'll just give you the acronym, CCW in Geneva, and indeed under an Indian chair last year, agreed on 10 principles. It's not by any means law or political declarations or statements yet, but that the core of those principles that were agreed as a basis for going forward was first that IHL, international humanitarian law, applies to lethal autonomous weapon system. Second, that human responsibility for decisions on use must be retained. And third, as Susan flagged, Article 36 reviews must be critical. But I want to put forward a couple of thoughts that I think going forward and building on some of those principles we might need to think about. I'm going to argue that we will need a multi-pronged, multi-stakeholder approach to regulating autonomous weapon systems. That cannot be just only done at the level of the international states regulating what and how we think about and measure these systems, but is going to require that we really unpack systems. And that means thinking about design and research and development, what is human responsibilities at that moment, and what are aspects. Second, it might come down to the development and the testing of autonomous weapons systems. What sort of systems and regulations are we going to need? At what level? At national level? At industry standards level? At perhaps processes that we've seen in industries such as the pharmaceutical industry or the aviation industry, where we see industry standards, industry testing, industry verification, and industry certification mechanisms. Then we come to then and only then, I would say, we come to the levels of issues around deployment, issues around authorization, and issues around use. And I would insert in there something that the member states haven't yet addressed, but issues around training. Because I think if we're looking at how we're thinking about the level of risk we want to have in automation, we're going to completely think in new ways about the training of human operators, human authorizers, human validators for certain functions. So I suppose where I would differ from Cara and Sarah, Susan, is that I think we need to move away from just talking about the moment of targeting, the moment of authorization, and the moment of the use of force, to think much more on the spectrum of the role of humans at various stages of process. If we think in that way, it allows us to think about who and what is responsible and is accountable, and what systems and mechanisms are needed at different phases. And that might mean then a combination of industry, national, regional, and international regulation frameworks, bodies, some of them voluntary, perhaps some of them enforced. I'll end with just three thoughts. One is arms control, and I come from a UN institute that thinks a lot about how to manage arms control and international legally binding frameworks for that. Is arms control is based on physical characteristics of the weapon. Traditionally, it's been based on describing that, getting very precise, and then regulating that. Question I'll put out to all of us to think about is, do traditional arms control approaches apply when we think about autonomous weapon system and when we think about artificial intelligence, where we're looking at intangible things and where we're looking at things like algorithms? And that comes back to this whole idea, well then, what sorts of alternative regulatory frameworks would we need? Second, and it's something that you've mentioned, Hans, is how do we think about regulation when the chief developers may no longer be the state and the military capabilities and forces of the state, but sits outside, we've heard dual use, but really sits outside bodies that don't even sit within a nation state, multinational corporations that belong to no one single state or regulatory framework. And the third, I want to just put out there, and maybe we can return to it in the discussion, is how does AI affect warfare? Even notwithstanding the commitment of member states that international humanitarian law will apply, the distinctions between offensive and defensive, the distinctions between thresholds of conflict, the distinctions between the nature of combatants in conflict is being affected in very real terms by autonomous weapon systems, and is something that we're going to need to think about. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. And however, I do not see any quick fixes on this. At the same time, the technology is moving at light speed. But a bit to talk about the processes. Dr. Carbonnier, you're Vice President of the ICRC, Professor of Development Economics. We expect you to have most of the answers here. How do we manage this challenge? What institutions, what rules should we go by? And if I may push you a bit, how do we get China, Russia, and the United States on board from the very beginning? Good luck.
I wish I would have all the answers, but good afternoon, everyone. And I think the presentation by my fellow panelists clearly show that the question of regulating the emergence and advances in technology that includes the emergence of lethal autonomous weapon system represent one of the critical challenge in terms of humanitarianism of the future. And we are very thankful to the ORF for organizing this panel and being able to engage. And it's very timely because in 2 months' time, we will resume conversation in Geneva in the governmental group of experts on lethal autonomous weapons systems. And I think a lot of the key questions have been already raised by the previous speakers. So let me just say that I want to share with you, and this is my main message, a sense of urgency. A sense of urgency to reconsider and frame the relationship between machines and humans when it comes to the use of force and to decision to attack and kill and destroy. And our concern is that we see exponential advances in technology that finds application in the military sphere, but we see a much slower pace of adaptation when it comes to discussions and reflection that includes ethics, norms, and law. And there is really a sense of urgency that must be shared with you, representative of states, companies, the science community, as well as the civil society, to act and progress rapidly. Why do I say so? We, the International Committee of the Red Cross, well, we are an independent, impartial, neutral humanitarian organization, but we witness directly on the ground the humanitarian impact, the human cost of the use of different means and methods of warfare in today's armed conflicts, which tends to be highly messy, urban, with attacks and activities in highly populated area, where having just sensors together with algorithm that takes decisions that once activated cannot be deactivated would be absolutely horrendous in terms of potential human costs. So with that, I think Susan has rightly mentioned that there are a number of fundamental principles in international humanitarian law that led us to decide to prohibit or to frame very rigorously a number of new weapons. And this is nothing new. We were in St. Petersburg just a few weeks ago to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the St. Petersburg Declaration to prohibit the use of explosive projectiles. And since then, we have seen a ban on the use of chemical and biological weapons, and more recently, anti-personnel landmine. What are the critical issues is actually in the case of lethal autonomous weapon systems that actually use learning machines and artificial intelligence to learn without a constant and direct human control over decisions can be very difficult to implement if we want to be serious with the principle of distinction between military objectives, which can be legitimate objectives, and civilians and civilian objects, which must be protected at all times. Then the principle of proportionality that Susan was referring to means that it is necessary to assess the proportionality between the expected military advantages of an attack versus the potential, what we call today, collateral damage that such an attack could have. And then to pass a judgment whether the principle of proportionality is upheld before deciding of an attack. And finally, the principle of precaution, which means to take all the precaution that is needed to avoid unnecessary suffering. And we contend that this cannot be left to machines alone, and that an element of human control must be retained at the different phases that Renata was referring to before. At the design phases, there is a clear responsibility with regard to precaution. And then when we move at the activation phase, there is a clear accountability that must be maintained between the intention and the decision of a military commander, and then at the operational level, the human and humanitarian consequences of the attack and potential violations of international humanitarian law that must be attributed then to commanders who took the decisions. And this is in this framework that I must say that we very much welcome the progresses that have been achieved over the last 2 years under the very agile leadership of Ambassador Gilles of India, within the group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapon system that was referred to, where we see a broad agreement, I would say, emerging that some character or element of human control must be retained. And we see an overarching consensus that international humanitarian law applies. But then I would say that this is a very fragile consensus, and the discussion that will restart and resume in March will be critical, because I think that there is no consensus or common understanding on what elements of human control actually means. And if I may just push a bit the argument and leave it then there, we just to take a number of examples in which in type of environment lethal autonomous weapon system can operate, and what kind of target can be selected. we have lethal autonomous, well, lethal, I would just say lethal, but autonomous weapon systems that are in use today. For instance, weapons that once activated aim to destroy an incoming missile. So this is in the air, where obviously there is no many civilians around that can be killed by the same token, and this is also destroying material. But then when it comes to contemporary conflicts in Syria, in Yemen, in South Sudan and elsewhere, how do we ensure in highly populated areas that the principle of precaution, proportionality and distinction will be actually applied is highly problematic, and I would suggest that we have to look very carefully at the type of environment in which such weapons can be envisaged, and the type of control that must be retained at each and every level, also at the operational level, meaning that there must be a possibility to deactivate or abort an attack at any moment when the situation, which is very fluid on the ground, dictates so. One example, if a combatant is put out of combat, either because the combatant surrendered or because the combatant is injured, well, international humanitarian law dictates that that combatant must be spared, the life must be spared, and more than that, the combatant has to be accessing health care and then possibly being detained. And these are very tricky questions when it comes to lethal autonomous weapon systems, and I think that the discussions that we will have from March onwards in Geneva will be determining in, I hope, finding a way to provide for an appropriate framework, and you can count on the International Committee of the Red Cross to participate with states, with non-state experts in trying to find a solution that is consistent with international humanitarian law.
Thank you very much, Gilles. Fascinating and excellent presentation. I would like to open up for questions now, but I would like to ask the panel, when we have our sum up, what questions are we underestimating? When we have this exact same panel in Raisina 2024, what questions will be looking back and saying, we should have focused more on those? What will surprise us in the next 5 years? What are we underestimating? That'd be very, very interesting. And I feel that this panel is not quite reflective. We are not of course, we cannot have representatives from terrorist organizations, international crime, or state actors who are not playing by the rules. But those are the ones who really concern me, who are literally playing by different kinds of games, while we are restricted. We want to restrict these measures, but how do you deal in a world where everybody does not play by the same rules? May I open up to the young fellows to start off with? Sir? One more time, we can't hear you.
Okay. My name is David. I have from Germany. I have the privilege to command a submarine.
Good.
So at Raisina 2024, will there still be a need for these commanders? Following your argumentation, you just bought me some time. My question is, which of the factors that you mentioned is like the most inhibiting one? So is it the current state of technology? Is it ethical concerns, legal restraints, or what you mentioned, like maybe military and government people being more conservative? And if my job was obsolete one day, how long would it take to reverse that decision, because we realized that autonomous systems are not that very much defended against like cyber attacks? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's an excellent question, not least the vulnerability of this. Are we all moving like a pack of animals in the one direction and not understanding what kind of inbuilt vulnerabilities we have? Anybody from the panel would like to take that one?
Well, I can give it a go. I think you won't be out of a job in the next 5 years. And I think you won't be out of a job because I think the unpredictability is a major concern for militaries around the world. As you know, policy, doctrine, procedures, tactics, techniques are based on predictable and regulated approaches. I, for one, have some faith in state security forces also being attached to certain patterns of warfare and laws of war. I mean, I think that that's something that is inherent in many cultures around the world and is manifested in IHL. So I think that concern for unpredictability, and the concern is what it might mean for large employers of men and women, that is the foundational institution of many states, is a concern. It's an existential concern for security forces. So I think that aspect is going to be even a bigger driver than the ethical aspect. Now, when you say, what do we think we can see in 5-10 years, I see us focusing much more on the human-machine interaction. And I think the issue of trust between humans and machines is going to be as important as you're raising the issue, Hans, of the issue of trust between states. And so I think understanding how you build trust, understanding how much data do you need to make an algorithm predictable, how much testing do you need, how much can you test a swarm or trust a swarm. That's the sort of issue that I think in 4 to 5 years when we come back here, that's where we're going to be interfacing on. And I would just finish off on one point that I think going forward, concepts of deterrence are going to become critical in the IT and AI and cyberspace, because it's going to be how you prevent your own fully automated defense system from being breached. So I think what would be really interesting is to get all these nuclear deterrence strategists to start thinking about information deterrence and new forms of deterrence based around AI and autonomy.
Susan?
Yeah. Yes, just to reiterate the point that's just been made. As a serving person, reliability and predictability of a weapon system, it seemed to me, would be fairly key. Predictability particularly. Nobody likes working with something, or someone for that matter, that they don't know how they're going to react in a certain set of situations, particularly key lethal situations. And I think also the predictability and reliability piece does go to the legal question, which again, when you're attempting to do an Article 36 review, one of the things that you would have had to have done during the review process, and just to go back slightly, one of the things about an Article 36 review is that it does not take place just when you're about to deploy the weapon. It takes place much, much earlier. It takes place as early as development and then into procurement. So it's at a very early stage, and it should go through all the verification processes just to make that clear. So it's not a last-minute review, or shouldn't be a last-minute review. So, both reliability and predictability, it seems to me, is fairly key. In relation to the issues, Hans, that you raised, oddly, one of the things that does occur to me is that, 5-10 years out, we're talking about these weapon systems in a way that they appear to be bad things. Actually, one of the unexpected consequences could be that society generally thinks they're a really good thing, and that they think that's the way that we should be fighting, and that there will be increased pressure from society to deliver results in that way, reducing potential casualties. And I can see that is a sort of unexpected consequence, perhaps.
Excellent. Kara?
If you don't mind.
Please.
So I think there are two hard impasses that are pretty tough to resolve at this point. And one of them is that the CCW is a consensus-based organization. So getting anything legally binding is going to be tricky because you have to have all parties on board. Second, and I think most importantly, number one factor is, for me, the tech, at least, the pace of the technology, sort of advancing much, much faster than any diplomatic processes or getting people together in a room to agree even on the definition of autonomous weapons. That kind of speaks for itself, yet advances in AI science have been made in the time that it takes people to fly over to Geneva. So I think making things that are tech neutral is probably the best approach. That's why lawyers talk about lex lata, everything as it is, and sort of base it off of what's happening in the technology, because you can't keep changing laws to conform to what the technology is doing on a day-to-day basis. The technology is just too diffuse. And then I would echo what Renata was saying earlier. So hardware is sexy, right? Everybody likes battleships and tanks and planes and whatnot. But here, what we're talking about is software. And with with that comes its own set of vulnerabilities, its own set of problems. It's very dense. It's really tough to have transparency in software. So I think the tech is a huge consideration when you're talking about making any framework that's legally binding or any sort of effective governance, if that's even possible.
Thank you very much. You had no idea what kind of can of worms you opened there.
Hi.
Sir, please.
This is Jitain from India. Not that we are paranoid about China, but the word China has been mentioned more than, I think, 1,500 times in the last 3 days by all the panelists. So my question is that, the State Council of China decided to spend $150 billion on AI with a special focus on autonomous weapons, which is like they're outspending the entire world, including the United States and Russia, on AI. Do you think the countries which are already posing a direct threat to the rule-based order in the world by territory grabbing and debt finance debt traps, do you see a concern that these countries, if they lead the autonomous weapons race today, there will be a world where there will be technology trapping by offering autonomous weapons to destabilize other countries? Thank you.
I think it's an excellent question. Gilles?
Just to say that it is absolutely critical to have a negotiation process that is broad encompassing and where, of course, the major countries that invest in AI and lethal autonomous weapon system are at the table and bring not only government representatives, but again, it's critical to have this discussion between legal experts, military experts, and the science community. And China, as well as Russia and the US and other, well, the UK for that matter, and other powers have to be at the table. And this is where we see in Geneva, in the negotiations, that there is no consensus on some of the critical principles. What does it mean and what is the level that is required in terms of reliability, previsibility, and predictability, which are, I think, two critical issues. And just to address also the question of what will we discuss in 5 years' time, because, in terms of futurology, as an economist, I always resist reading in a crystal ball because we have been very poor as economists to foresee the huge financial crisis of 2008. But I think it's even worse to try to foresee where we will be in 5 years' time with regard to technology, because I remember that just 2 years back, we were grappling with the issue of how to frame legally, but also ethically, the question of unmanned drones attacking and killing targets in Yemen and being actually piloted from thousands of miles away, and what it took in terms of engaging the commanders who go and with a joystick do 8 hours a day of piloting and then goes back home in a context of peace. And while we were struggling with these ethical questions and the legal implications, actually at the same time we discovered that autonomous weapon systems were being developed where we could, well, let's take an example. For me, as slightly bald and gray hair, well, you can have an autonomous weapon system with instruction to find and select and kill all, males with rather bald and or some gray hair. So this is just as a joke, but more seriously, what we can imagine is the need to select targets with carrying weapons. And in many countries where we, the international community of the Red Cross, we are operating as a humanitarian organization, everyone carries a weapon. All males carry a weapon, and it doesn't mean that these are all combatants. Some of them in some countries are hunters, but more broadly, this is also a question of culture, and these are questions which will be extremely complex to address, and this is where the human element is absolutely critical in keeping the control all the way from the design to the activation and the operational level.
Thank you very much. Could I just part there? As we do not have any member from the PLA's Academy of Military Sciences on the panel here, let me quote Xi Jinping from 2013. "Advanced technology is the sharp weapon of the modern state. Our technology still generally lags behind the developed countries, and we must adopt an asymmetrical strategy of catching up and overtaking bringing our own advantages to bear. The sharpest weapon of the state should not be revealed." End quote. Kara.
So I think we have to take a look at the track records and the systems of governance that deal with these technologies. China in particular, they thus far do not have a good short track record of facial recognition technologies. Right now, they're trying to make it as ubiquitous as possible. In certain provinces, it's all over the place. So I'm kind of skeptical over their ban on the use of autonomous, or their support for the ban on use of fully autonomous weapons in April, because I take a look at what they've been doing so far with the technologies that they've developed, and the outlook is not so sanguine. So I do think that we have to pay attention to the way that these governments and politicians and countries govern their own populations in order to extrapolate what they're going to do with these technologies in the future. And I think in the case of China, it's pretty clear, and we need to be aware of that as an international community.
Thank you very much. Could I ask the panel, just in a brief summary, one or 2 points. What do we need to think more about in the future? And what kind of concepts and mindsets do we need to have to be open for the challenges we're facing? Let me start with you, Renata.
The big questions and little time, but I guess I would think that one of the concerns that I have is of convergence issues. We spend a lot of time speaking about AI. There's another group speaking about cyber. There's another community speaking about quantum computing. But I think where some of the most potential for risk and instability lies in the convergence of these systems. It's no accident that one of the biggest risks to machine learning and machine-driven systems is cyber attacks or hacking or potential. So how do we think about those convergence and how we play those out through scenarios, through much more interactions between states and militaries against that? And the second thing I would say is that on this point about human and machine interaction, I really think that is a place where we need to interrogate and investigate our different cultural understandings. Because at the heart of all our assumptions about human-machine learning and interactions is that we bring with us very different notions of humans and machines, and I think that's worth a broader international discussion on. And finally, I mentioned deterrence, but I'll end with that word for the world of artificial intelligence. Thanks.
Thank you. Brilliant. Susan?
Can I just say I agree with all that has just been said. I think I would also mention possibly 2 other things. One is the very vulnerability of those systems could mean, I suppose, that from a military point of view, that those systems become so vulnerable that actually what we forget to do is fundamental basic war fighting, war fighting analog, in an analog age as opposed to a digital age, and that we get bypassed almost. And the second area is that enforcing compliance of the rule of law and IHL more generally, and that has to be continually promoted. And because those nations that you refer to, and I have to say I didn't mention China, those nations that you refer to may not be any more amenable to any more regulation. They are already signed up to certain elements of certain treaties, and therefore and are subject to certain aspects of customary international law, and therefore we should try to continue to develop the compliance with IHL principles, and the process that's been gone through by the group of governmental experts and the CCW process, and the engagement of states and the encouragement of engagements in states in that process is key.
Outstanding. Gilles, final thoughts.
Well, since time is up, as I see, I won't repeat what has been said, but I think it is critical to look at what we have done in terms of successful negotiations, reaching consensus, to either find and design and agree on an appropriate framework for new weapons, means and methods of warfare, or to reach a ban of certain uses and new methods of warfare. And often this has grown out of a web of prevention if I look at the biological sphere, for instance, where states, but also research labs, the scientific community has worked hard also with civil society, organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the business community, those who develop the applications. And I think it is a collective effort that must cut across sectors, but also countries. We mentioned China, and I think it will be critical to have the major actors at the table in this web of prevention.
Yes.
All right,
Kara,
so Samir is looking at his watch, so I'll be brief. I think there's a whole new level of risk that opens up when you're talking about machines that are operating solely in the digital space. So what some would call the machine domain. This introduces new vulnerabilities in both the weapons themselves and when the systems are used in cyberspace. So when mistakes can happen at machine speed and that's escalated considerably, I think those are the things that we have to worry about, and they haven't been talked enough about so far.
Thank you very much. May I ask the audience for a warm applause for the panel?